Well, good morning, everyone. It's 9:32, so I think we'll probably make a start. Welcome to our latest CLA webinar, and today we're looking at forestry. My name is Graham Clark. I'm going to chair the event, and I'm Senior Land Use Policy Advisor at the CLA, and I lead on all the forestry work that we do. Many of you will be CLA members. Some of you might not be. For those who don't know who we are, we're a membership organisation for owners of rural land and rural businesses. We've got about 25,000 members nowadays. We try to influence rural policies to make operating your businesses as easy as possible. And we advise our members, and we work with organisations such as the Forestry Commission, who are with us today, to put on useful advisory events for you to help you run your business. So today we're looking at productive forestry, woodland creation with timber in mind. There's been renewed interest in forestry from government in recent years, and particularly in the last 2 or 3 years. Ministers and their strategy documents, etc., have been increasingly clear that they want more productive conifer forestry as part of the mix. And we use a lot of timber in the UK. We import a lot of that timber, and demand globally is rising. So everything points towards us having more productive conifer forestry as part of the efforts to increase our tree cover. So, what are we going to cover today? I'll introduce the speakers in a minute. I'm going to chair the event, but today this is what we're going to cover. We're going to have the first speaker on what we mean by productive forestry and how you can go about creating it. Then we'll hear a bit about grants. And we'll also cover some of the tax considerations, and there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. So today we're joined by 3 speakers, 2 from the Forestry Commission and 1 from the CLA. First speaker will be Chris Watson. Welcome, Chris. He is a woodland resilience advisor with the Forestry Commission. And secondly, we'll have Natalie Breeden-Smith, who is a land use advisor with the Forestry Commission. Welcome, Natalie. And you're going to talk about the grants side of things. And then thirdly, my colleague Louise Speak, our Chief Taxation Advisor at the CLA. Welcome, Louise. She's going to run through some of the tax considerations for all of this. So we'll have time at the end for questions. Please store up any questions that you have. We're not going to take those as we go through. We just find that it works smoother in a sort of hour-long sort of event to have questions at the end. But please note them down, and we'll have 10. See how much time we have at the end. But we've booked in at least 10 minutes for questions. We might have a little bit more if things go well. Put your questions into the Q&A function, not the chat, and that will make it easier for us to monitor, and we'll deal with questions at the end. There will be a recording of the webinar circulated at the end, which will include the slides, so you will be able to have a record of the actual slides, but we'll see how we get on. Right, that's enough from me. First speaker is Chris from Forestry Commission, and Chris is going to take us through the what, why and how of productive forestry. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Graham. Morning, everybody. Thanks for having me along to speak. Much appreciated. As Graham's outlined, basically what I want to do this morning is just talk through kind of what it is we mean when we talk about productive forestry, what we're talking about, and obviously, as Graham's flagged, we're largely talking about timber here. We'll talk about why we want productive forestry and link it back to some of the policy ambitions that government have. And then I'll also give you a high level walk through what productive forestry looks like in practice in terms of actually putting it in the ground and managing it, and getting to the point where you can reap the rewards, as it were. So if we move on to the first slide, please, Graham. So one of the things we talk about a lot when we talk about government policy relating to trees is natural capital value, ecosystem services provision. And what we're really talking about is all those benefits that woodlands are providing to society. Okay, and there's a lot of work being done to try and value those benefits, those outputs. And it's estimated, and this is, admittedly, this is from 2018, but it's fairly up to date actually. This diagram just shows quite neatly what all those values look like and what the value is. And the value is estimated at an asset value of 175 billion. So that's the overall woodland asset for England. And the annual value is 4.9 billion. Okay, so what's generated year on year is 4.9 billion. Now, that's all the benefits that we get from woodlands. The reason I'm showing this diagram is you can see there's loads of things we get there. We get biodiversity, we get air pollution absorption, we get protection from noise, flood, heat reduction, lots and lots of benefits. But as a landowner, a lot of those benefits can feel relatively intangible. Those are the benefits the society receives from woodlands, not necessarily the benefits that you can directly access as a landowner. And there's one or two values in there which actually do have a means to generate direct income. Carbon sequestration and selling carbon credits is one of those. Recreation and using woodland areas for other purposes that you can either charge rent for or admittance for, etc. That's a means of generating direct income. And the one that we really sort of want to focus on today is forestry, timber production, wood production. Okay, and so that's what I'm going to talk about today. But it's just to flag that sort of why this is so important is that in the context of all the benefits that woodlands provide, timber is still one of the principal means of generating income and a return from your woodland. So that's the context in which I want to sort of talk through this. If we move on to the next slide, please, Graham. So what is the woodland resource in England? The woodland resource in England is predominantly broadleaves. I'm going to talk about broadleaf as opposed to native woodland because not all that broadleaf woodland is native, but it's broadleaf woodland, what we would think of as probably native trees. That's almost 50% is just other broadleaf woodland. We also have a high percentage of our woodland is what we call ancient semi-natural woodland. So around 19% of our woodland is ancient semi-natural woodland. So that's stuff that's been here since at least 1600. So that's really, really important. They're the sort of the crown jewels in terms of the woodland that we have. In total, you can see that between those two values, we're getting up to, you know, nearly 70% of our woodland is broadleaf woodland. Conifer makes up a relatively small proportion, and pure conifer, usually productive conifer, makes up only 19%, possibly 20% of our woodland. And I just want to show you that breakdown in terms of what the woodland asset looks like across England. Okay, if you looked at this at the UK level, it's slightly different. Scotland and Wales have a much higher proportion of conifer, and that shifts the balance a little bit. But England is very much a broadleaf country. Next slide, please, Graham. So if we have that woodland resource in context, to refer back to something Graham mentioned at the start, as the UK, we currently import 73% of the timber we use. All right, we're a big user of timber. There's a close correlation between economic development and timber use. You don't need me to tell you that the benefits of using timber for locking up carbon, for green building materials, is pretty well understood, and there's a real demand for that. The challenge is getting hold of it. So we use currently 73% import 73% of the timber we use. By 2050, global demand for timber is expected to quadruple. Okay, so as other countries develop economically, the demand for timber is increasing exponentially. Our actual production of timber in the UK, so what we're actually growing and producing ourselves, is set to peak around 2030. So, you know, if you think of all those plantations that were established during the 60s, 70s and 80s, they're all coming online now. We generate timber from those. Sort of maximum volume production is due to peak around 2030. And after that, we'll see a reduction again in terms of available volume from UK sources. Over this same period then, so we've got a reducing supply of our own after 2030. We've got a substantial increase in international demand, and at the same time, there's not predicted to be a corresponding increase in available resource internationally. The actual resource that's available for harvesting internationally is being constrained. Combination of factors from environmental protection, overlogging in certain countries, and then also even simple things like climate change in the Baltic areas and in Northern Europe, where actually accessing some of the timber is becoming harder because of warmer winters, and they can't use the ice to access timber. There's a whole number of factors that play into this, but essentially what we're saying is the resource we've got to pull timber from isn't really going anywhere. It is what it is. It's not going to increase significantly, but demand is going to increase significantly. And as we're a substantial net importer of timber, we're going to be very vulnerable to those pressures and trying to get hold of timber from an international market. So in that context, then, yeah, we want to think about the resource that we've got and how we use it. So next slide, please, Graham. So what is the resource that we actually need? So we're talking about, obviously there's a lot of pressure. It makes sense to try and produce as much. We're never going to be self-sufficient, but produce as much of our own timber as we can to reduce our liability to that exposure. So in the UK, our principal timber that is produced is softwood. And in England, in 2023, which is kind of at the point of putting these slides together, sort of the most up-to-date sort of figures, we generated just shy of 2 million green tons of softwood timber in England. Okay, and if we cast our minds back to those earlier slides that I was showing you about the makeup of English woodlands, what we're actually talking about here is that 23% of the woodland area in England produced 73% of the timber that we used, or that we produced. Okay, so that the softwood component of our woodlands is doing the heavy lifting. All right, next slide, please, Graham. If you compare that to the hardwoods, so remember the majority of our woodland resources is broadleaf woodland, we only produced 800,000 green tons in 2023. And one thing I'll draw your attention to in this graph is that the majority of that timber was used as firewood. So of that 800,000 green tons that we produced, the vast majority of it went for firewood and biomass, wood fuel. Okay. In comparison, the majority of the softwood resource went to timber and various degrees of timber, from sort of construction timber all the way down to things like fence posts and panel boards and things like that. So the hardwood resource that we're using, although we have markets for it, at the minute we're still using a substantial proportion of it just as firewood, because that's what the market demands is conifer. Next slide, please, Graham. So that leads me on to the point, and we've already flagged it initially. We need more conifer. Why do we need more conifer? Why does the industry use them? Well, first of all, traditionally they grow fast. They naturally grow in a form which makes them useful. So that, you know, if you think about a log which you want to put through a sawmill, conifers, if you put them in the ground and let them grow, will basically produce lots of logs. Okay, broadleaf trees, you've got to train them and treat them well and manage them carefully to generate those straight, clean logs. Conifers will produce that kind of by default. The timber properties, in really simple terms, is what the construction sector wants and what international markets want for most construction timber. Good strength to weight ratio, so quite lightweight but pretty strong, easy to work, predictable, and reliable timber. To add to the woes that we have, so we've talked about peak timber production. The other challenge we've got is that through a combination of factors, habitat restoration, improved forestry practices under the UK forestry standard, where we make sure that nature and biodiversity, etc., get a much bigger role in our woodlands. We've actually lost 48,000 hectares of productive conifer since 2000. Now, that's not necessarily in and of itself a bad thing. There's good reasons why we've done that. We planted trees on inappropriate sites in the past, and we've improved the quality of our woodlands for biodiversity and other values. However, it does mean that we're constraining an already small resource. So there's extra impetus to make up for that shortfall. Next slide, please, Graham. So I am kind of focusing on conifers, and the big drive is recognising that the industry wants conifer, and that we need more of it. Okay, but that's not saying broadleaves aren't productive. Broadleaves can be ridiculously productive, can be very valuable if they're grown well, and there's a lot of opportunity for us to do more with our broadleaves. There are some significant challenges, but with most of our broadleaf woodlands, or rather most of our woodlands being broadleaf, it makes sense for us to make better use of them. The other thing, which we're not going to dwell on too much today, but our woodlands really need managing. They face a whole number of threats, a whole number of challenges, and we really need people to be looking after and managing the woodlands, not to necessarily to a better standard. Lots are managed well, but as a whole, we need more woodlands in management. And if that's the case, then timber plays a really important role. So whilst timber might not be the primary objective for some of these woodlands, it plays a really important role in actually funding the management of those woodlands to deliver all the other benefits that we get. Okay, and timber production and biodiversity, etc., they're not mutually exclusive things. One can really benefit the other. So if we're serious about dealing with this timber issue and making the best use of our woodlands, then it's important that we also factor broadleaf woodlands into this productive component as well. Okay, next slide, please. So what's the benefits of productive woodlands? Well, there's loads. Diversification of business is obviously a big part of it. If you have woodland on your ground, then it makes sense to try and make something from it. There's potential tax advantages involved with productive woodland. And it is literally a resource that adds value over time. So essentially, when you plant trees and they start to grow, their value increases as they grow. It's as simple as that. It's for my simple mind, it's quite simple maths. Managing existing resources productively, I've already sort of mentioned, but it makes sense if you've got the resource to make best use of it. You can, and if you have some woodland on your ground, it might be that you maybe don't quite have enough for it to be viable. It's maybe a bit of a challenge to make money from it because you don't have enough of it. Creating new woodland can really tip that balance, and you can create a resource then on your holding that is actually sufficiently large to start to be economically viable in terms of management. For your own use, and certainly, you know, at home, you know, our biggest use of any woodland areas that we've got is for our own firewood and biomass. And I think for a lot of people, that's a really valuable resource in its own right. It's also something that's quite easy to sell in the market and find buyers for. And having woodland that you can produce products from and sell can also act as a basis for another business or contracting business. If you're set up to do agricultural contracting, for example, then woodland contracting isn't a million miles away, and generating some of your own firewood to be able to then go out and produce firewood from other people's woodlands as well is a good step on from having your own resource. So there's a lot of benefits from productive woodland. Next slide, please, Graham. I've got a slide in here that just kind of tries to show some of the main ways of making money from that productive woodland. So we've said already that the productive woodland isn't mutually exclusive to other benefits, but whilst we're talking primarily about timber here, there's other things around carbon offsets, and selling carbon credits can produce income. And the other thing is that, you know, the majority of the time the trees are in the ground, they just sit there growing. Okay, so yes, you come in every 5, 10, 15 years to do some thinning, or every 30, 40 years to do some harvesting, like felling. The rest of the time that woodland's sat there ticking over. And whether you want to be running a shoot in those woodlands, whether you want to be running forest schools, implementing infrastructure for people to access your woodlands, maybe pay for parking and things like that. There's ways you can utilise that resource while it's basically growing. Okay, and most of the woodlands I've worked in over the years have used that balance of timber production and other values at the same time. Next slide, please, Graham. So that's kind of the resource that we need. We need more conifer ideally, and we need to try and make better use of our woodlands if we can. And as I've said, a lot of our woodlands, most of our woodlands need some form of management. A lot of them would benefit from active productive management to deliver other benefits, and that timber resource really helps to underpin that management cost and cover costs. So from a policy perspective, then what is it that we're trying to actually achieve? What is the demand? Because I think a lot of people, if you looked at general media, general conversations in the public space, what you would pick up most of the time really is the need for nature recovery, to improve biodiversity values, to really try and help our landscape adapt to climate change. And all of that is totally valid and is baked into everything that we do. As I've already intimated, timber production and woodland management, etc., isn't separate from that. It's part of it, and one allows us to do the other better as well. So the first big piece of policy, which is probably the most recent piece of policy, which touches on the role of timber and timber production from a government perspective, is the Environmental Improvement Plan. It was published the end of last year, the end of 2025, and we worked hard with ministers to make sure that we've got some clear steers in there with regards timber and wood production, and that recognition of how it fits into the wider landscape and our woodland resource. And the EIP recognises the challenge we face that we've already outlined here around our domestic resource and timber security. It emphasises the role of timber in a circular economy. So if we're serious about economy that makes better use of our resources, and we're trying to remove stuff from landfills, so reuse things, keep it in the economy, don't waste stuff. Timber's brilliant for that. Timber can be recycled exponentially. It's fantastic. It really plays a strong role in that, and the minister's really keen on that. The minister's also committed, or the government's committed to delivering the timber and construction roadmap, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And given the need for more timber security, we're committed to an increase in the proportion of conifer species that needs to be part of the National Tree Planting Programme. So we've got a massive drive for woodland creation. We want more of that as timber. Okay, next slide, please, Graham. So the timber and construction roadmap was actually launched. It's been launched twice now, but essentially it was relaunched about this time last year, actually. And it's essentially the government commitment to how we're going to increase the use of timber in construction generally. So there's lots of benefits to using timber in construction, and that's timber as a resource, not just UK resource, but just timber in general. And as the strategy itself says, timber offers a solution as a renewable, low carbon resource. It offers immense potential to reduce emissions, create jobs, and build the homes we need. So timber, as we've said, as with all developing nations, economically developed nations, there's a real demand for timber for the benefits it provides. Next slide, please, Graham. And in that context, then, the strategy covers a number of different areas which is required to move greater proportions of timber into construction. And some of that's around insurance, safe design, skills, capacity, etc. But number 4, which is the area that I spend most of my time working on, and which is the sort of most relevant to what we're talking about today, is that increasing the supply of sustainable timber from the UK. Okay, we want to produce more of our own timber and use more of our own timber in construction. So there's a real clear government commitment to that, and as government and across government agencies and working with the industry, we're working really hard to actually make that a reality and to increase that proportion of productive resource, and inevitably, because of that, increase the proportion of coniferous woodland in the country. Next slide, please, Graham. So in that context, we talk about tree planting. We've got the 30,000 hectares a year target, which is what we're working to. Obviously, nature recovery and carbon sequestration are key objectives of that approach and are key drivers for it. But the general gist of this is that even if we plant more productive woodland, it still contributes to those objectives. Productive woodland locks up a lot of carbon. The actual carbon sequestration figures that we've used to underpin the justification for our woodland creation target recognises that about 30% of that should really be conifer to lock up as much carbon as we need to hit our climate change targets. And timber production, as we've said, it's not mutually exclusive to other benefits. A well-designed UKFS, UK Forestry Standard compliant woodland that's productive will meet objectives around biodiversity and protecting the environment, etc., because it's built into current legislation and best practices. So next slide, please, Graham. So that's why we've We want the resource that we want, and why that resource needs to kind of look the way it does. How are we actually going to go about doing that? What does this look like in practice? Next slide, please, Graham. So the first thing we've got to do is we've got to start with thinking about what is it that we're actually trying to achieve. If we're going to create a productive woodland, what is it that we're actually wanting? What's our aims as a landowner? What's the objectives for our woodland? Do we want shorter term income? Okay. Do we want to try and get as fast an income as we possibly can? Do we want an asset that's going to increase in value and produce income over time, and perhaps allow us to do other things with that land at the same time? So we've got to think about those objectives at the start. We then also need to think about the actual site itself, the ground that you want to create that woodland on. Okay, what are the site constraints? What you're going to be able to do? Things that will influence that are things like your soils, the local climate. Okay, so actually that's going to influence what trees you can grow, how productive they're going to be, what challenges you might have. But also there might be site constraints on there. Have you got protected areas on that site? Have you got archaeological features? If you've got biodiversity features of interest, etc., you've got to understand your site. So we need to do a detailed site survey, understand what you've got, understand your objectives, and then we can start to put the two things together. Next slide, please, Graham. And one of the big things that comes into that then is making a decision about what tree species you're going to plant, what your aims, what you're going to plant. You might be really keen on having a nice mixed multi-purpose woodland that's going to allow you to have amenity value, that's going to look nice in the landscape, that's going to allow you to undertake a number of recreational activities in that woodland and generate income over time and a resource, in which case you might be looking for a mix of conifer and broadleaves. You might just go down the broadleaf route. So long as those species are suitable for your site and that you've planted them in a way that allows them to grow together, so they generate what you want in the end and they don't outcompete each other and suppress one by one growing faster than the other, then species choice is the starting point. Next slide, please, Graham. And one of the things we have to take into account when we're planting tree species now is that while we've had a fairly steady, reliable mix of species that we work with in the past, climate change is really starting to provide some challenges, especially in the southeast of England at the moment. We're already starting to see those challenges, and maybe on things like heavy clay soils or light sandy soils, droughts, limited rainfall, high temperatures are all sort of starting to conspire to make some of the species that we've traditionally used far less suitable. So we really need to start thinking about not only is the tree suitable for the site now, so that's current soils, current climate, but also what's that climate going to be like in 20, 30, 40 years time, okay? Because the climate is changing. And we have a number of tools that can support you to do that. So if you've done your site survey, you understand your soils, you understand your objectives, you can use a couple of tools, one of which is the ecological site classification tool, which allows you to match species to your site conditions, and it will tell you which species are suitable for your site, and you can sort of pick from those species the ones that are going to best meet your objectives. But we can also use something called climate matching, which is basically looking at the future climate. So in the first instance, the ecological site classification tool will let you look at suitability of your site for 50, 60 years time in the future, and that will then allow you to choose species which are going to do well in the future, not just now, okay? And you'd be surprised how some species fall off the list in terms of suitability. But we can also use a climate matching tool to look at where species that are grown now with a climate that will match our climate in the future are. So we might want to start looking at some species that are doing really well in the south of France or the middle of France, because in 30, 40, 50 years time, the climate in the southeast of England is likely to be very similar. And by choosing those species, we can start to think about having a woodland which is going to be fit to continue to produce and be resilient in the future. Okay, so that future think is really important. This resource is going to develop over time. It's not going to happen in 5, 10 years. It's got to still be productive in 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years time. If you want to grow good quality hardwoods, you're talking potentially 100 years time. Okay, so that future look is really important. Next slide, please, Graham. So you thought about what you want to try and achieve, you thought about your species, you thought about what's suitable on the site. What is it that we're actually producing? What is the resource that we're actually producing from our woodlands? Well, some of you might have experience with woodland management, some of you might not, but basically any woodland and any tree can produce a range of different products with different markets. Okay, and normally the sort of the highest grade market, which usually comes from those nice clean lengths at the bottom of the tree, what you would think of as the tree trunk, allows us to produce saw logs. Okay, those are the things that go to a saw bench, get turned in, or go into a sawmill, either get turned into high quality timber, furniture, or they can be turned into veneers, can be used for construction timber, beams, etc. Or we might start to move down the line a little bit and move into things, especially in softwoods, things like bars, where we might use them for fencing bars and things like that, where we're talking about producing, if you think about all these new housing estates that you see that have got garden fences and sheds and decking and all that sort, that kind of market. Okay, stuff that maybe isn't quite structurally sound, but can still be sold and can still be really useful. We might produce fencing materials, so the smaller diameter stuff, or perhaps the more knotty stuff that's less suitable for sawn timber, we can produce into fence posts. With hardwoods, oak and chestnut particular lend themselves to split chestnut fencing, split posts, etc. And then as we move down below that, we start to get the sort of the rough ends of the trees, the really knotty parts, the bendy parts that aren't really suitable for processing into anything else. And from those we can produce, in softwoods, we produce chip for panel boards, OSB, MDF, etc. that extensively used in construction. We have a good homegrown market for that. Pulp for paper, if you're in the right parts of the country. That's still a big market for us up in the north. And then the sort of the bottom of the list, really, in terms of value, as in like basically anything can be used for this. We've got the firewood and the biomass market. Okay, so you've got a whole range of products that you could potentially produce from your woodland. And the reason this is important is because there's a correlation between the species that you choose and the way you manage it as to what proportion of those products you're going to produce. And you need to be planning that from the start. Okay, next slide, please, Graham. So what's involved then? You've got your trees in the ground. You've decided you're going to plant a nice mixed conifer woodland to be productive. You want to produce as much saw log as you can in 50 years' time. What's involved in getting it there? Well, the first thing is, once you've actually got those trees in the ground, you've done some ground preparation that's appropriate to the site. There's good advice available online on that. You've got your trees in the ground. You need to keep them weed free. You need to let them grow and get established. Okay, you want them up and away. You need to make sure they're protected from deer and browsing animals, all right? And that includes squirrels. Broadleaves are particularly susceptible to squirrels, and there's parts of England where it's very, very difficult to grow quality hardwoods without really intensive squirrel control, because the squirrels will damage hardwood trees. They'll also damage softwoods, but hardwoods are the real susceptibles. If you're growing trees for timber, especially hardwoods, whilst the trees are young, anywhere between that sort of 10 and 15, 20-year-old, you might need to formatively prune. So removing big forks, removing big heavy side branches so that you're producing those nice, clean, straight logs. You want to make sure you've got access. You're going to create woodland that's going to be managed. How are you going to get the timber out? Okay, we're going to talk about grants in a minute, but basically there's a lot of support out there for infrastructure, etc. Make sure you've thought about how you're going to get that timber and that resource out, and put that infrastructure in when you get started, so that you can undertake all these management operations efficiently. Once the trees get big enough, you want to thin regularly to develop the stability of the stand and to start to return income and improve the form and the quality of the trees that you've got left. And then you'll get to a point where you start to generate the final end product that you're aiming for, which is your timber, your end product, and that's your harvesting. And that harvesting can take place in a number of different ways. Next slide, please, Graham. So in some situations, you might be wanting to do thinning to improve the quality of a final crop for clear fell. In some situations, you might want to maintain a crop over time through something called continuous cover forestry, where you constantly just basically thin and then start to regenerate a woodland underneath. Okay. Either way, thinning is absolutely critical to delivering this, and the type of thinning you choose will dictate the end result that you get. So, but thinning is really, really important. And in a lot of our broadleaf woodlands in particular, what thinning also really is important for is allowing light level to the woodland floor and starting to allow an understory to develop, which is really important for biodiversity and all those other benefits that you can produce from a woodland. Next slide, please, Graham. So you thin your woodland. What's the end look like? Well, clear fell's the one that we're probably all familiar with. Go and remove an area completely and then come back and restock it. That can be quite economically efficient, but it does have the downside that you've also got the restocking costs afterwards. Coppicing is probably something like a halfway house, whereby in most of our broadleaf woodlands, you can come in, you can fell the trees and they will regrow back from the stump if that's what you want. And there's actually quite, for the right species, there's quite a strong market for coppice products, fencing in particular, as in the image shown here at the bottom. Or something that we're really trying to encourage and get people to consider for their woodlands is something called continuous cover forestry. And as the image shows you here, that's where you maintain a constant cover of tree cover across the whole site, and you regenerate the next crop or the next generation of trees underneath the existing one. So just by gradual and continual thinning, you gradually move the overstory and allow another understory to develop, and that provides your next crop. And that has a number of benefits, both in terms of biodiversity, in terms of reducing the restocking costs, and it's also really resilient and flexible in a changing climate and in a challenging future. Next slide, please, Graham. So, and if you just click again, Graham, there's a bit will come up. That's it. Oh, no, sorry. No, you're all right. 1 2 minutes. It's all right. That's it. Thanks, Graham. So I've covered a lot here. It's all very high level, but what I will flag is that there's a lot of really good resources out there to support you with this decision making and start to get you thinking. And one of the things we've developed is something called the forest development types. And what this basically is a recipe for how you choose species that will work together, how they match to the soils that you've got, and how over a period of time you should manage those trees to get the end result that you want. So it's literally a recipe for growing trees, okay? And it's essentially productively focused. It's designed for productive forestry, and it's a fantastic resource. If you do nothing else off the back of today, I would suggest you just go and have a look at forest development types. They're on the Forest Research website. They're just really interesting, and it'll just give you a little insight into the thought process and the planning that goes into actually managing a well-designed productive woodland. Okay, but that's a resource to go away and have a look at. If you want any further advice, area woodland officers, area teams are right there to help you and to point you in the right direction. There's never been a better time for productive forestry, I don't think, in a lot of ways. But we just need to get the message out there that it's something that we want, that it's something that can benefit yourselves, and that we're really keen to support. Thank you very much, Graham.
Right. Well, thanks a lot for that, Chris. You covered a lot of ground there. Good to hear that there's some really strong policy intent behind all of this now, and you've outlined that and the demand for it and how to go about it. But all of this depends on money, doesn't it? At the end of the day, it costs to get these things into the ground, and the length of time involved in trees means that most people tend to rely on a bit of grant money to help do it. So Natalie's now going to take us through some of the funding through grants for forestry. So Natalie.
Thank you, Graham. So I'm going to do a quick quiz through some of the Forestry Commission grants available to you if you're thinking of starting productive woodland, whether it be broadleaf or conifer. So I'm a land use advisor. There's many of us that work around the country to promote these Forestry Commission grants. So we can come out and do one-to-one visits and offer free advice to see how trees can fit into your business and your holding, but we also do large-scale events as well. So look out for those. First slide, please. Thank you. So this is a bit of a timeline of grants that you might go through with the Forestry Commission, starting with the Woodland Creation Planning Grant, which essentially does what it says on the tin. It supports you to help design and plan your new woodland. Next would be the England Woodland Creation Offer, sometimes shortened to UCO. So this is the doing grant. This actually helps you get those trees in the ground. You then might want to start thinking about private finance. So, for example, the Woodland Carbon Code. And then once your woodland starts getting more established, you can start looking at countryside stewardship and how you might manage that woodland. I'm going to go into a bit more detail about each of these now. Next slide, please. So the first being the planning grant. You don't have to go through this first, but I think if you're thinking about planting non-native species and conifer species, it's a good idea to go through this grant, which will help identify all those things you might need to consider when you're planning your productive woodland. So to be eligible, first of all, your woodland needs to be a minimum size of 5 hectares. And there's up to £30,000 available for each site. So the woodland doesn't need to be a block size of 5 hectares. It can be made up of much smaller areas of 0.1 hectares, but the woodland does need to be a minimum width of 20 metres. Next slide, please. So there are 2 stages to this grant. The first one being a desk-based assessment to basically look at what actually might be possible on the site, so identifying those whatever constraints you might have. The second stage is actually getting into the design plans of your new woodland. There's also supplementary funding for any additional surveys you might need. So if you've got, I don't know, historic features on site, or you've got protected areas nearby, that sort of thing. So the next one is the England Woodland Creation Offer. So this is our flagship grant. This is actually what I would describe as the doing grant. This helps you get those trees in the ground. So the starting size of woodland needs to be 1 hectare. Again, it can be made up of much smaller blocks or of a minimum size of 0.1 hectare. The land needs to be free of other existing grant schemes, so no countryside stewardship, for example, on it already. It also supports natural colonisation, so if you've got other woodlands nearby, you can think about doing that. You can do a mix of planting. There are options available with this grant. And we can also accept joint applications, which is really interesting. If you're part of, for example, a cluster group or something, you can put a joint application in together. Next slide, please. So just to highlight some of the aspects of this grant. So first of all, there's the standard cost. So this actually helps you get those trees in the ground. So there's up to £10,200 per hectare available for that. The infrastructure payment. So like Chris mentioned, it's really important to get the infrastructure of your new woodland correct if you're planning a productive woodland. So thinking about those access tracks and timber stacking areas. Then you get maintenance payments. So there's £400 per hectare per year available for 15 years. So the grant runs for 15 years. So that pays for any trees that might die and helps you maintain those trees over those 15 years. And then there's additional payments. So if your land is deemed low sensitivity, so this essentially means if it doesn't have any protected features on it, any historic features, protected species, then it will be deemed as low sensitivity, and there's an extra £1,100 per hectare available if your land is within that. And then there's these things called additional contributions. So these are one-off payments with the thinking about the multiple benefits that woodlands provide. So this is done using spatial mapping. So it's totally thinking about where your new woodland is going to be created. So you could be eligible for, or if we go on to the next page, actually, there's a list of the ones that are available. So you could be eligible for most of these, you could be eligible for none of these, but if you're clever, you can put your woodland in the right places to get to maximise these additional contributions. So if you get one of our, sorry, just go back a second, Graham. So it can be quite complicated using the mapping. So this is all, you can have a look online and see what you might be eligible for. But if you get one of our land use advisors out, they'll be able to support you and show you what is actually eligible on your land. Yeah, next slide, please. Thank you. So this just highlights that there's a partnership with Forestry England going on at the moment. So if you're interested in productive forestry, but you don't actually want to do all the work, you can rent your land out to Forestry England, who will help establish and manage that woodland. So you'd get the rental income for that, and you can also stack your private finance. So for example, carbon credits on top of that. So you could get that financial income without having the hassle of having to manage the woodland, really. Next slide, please. So this is an infographic pulled from a real case study of creating a commercial woodland over 100 hectares and how the grants actually stack up compared to agricultural income. So this is from 2024. it's over a 50-year period, as obviously trees and woodlands are a long-term investment. So while it's very difficult to predict agricultural income with certainty over that period, this case study uses a 5-year average from farm business income from the annual farm business survey for England and Wales to estimate the income foregone. So to give you a bit of context, this landowner was an arable farmer previously, and it basically shows that overall there's a net income of £916,500 per hectare. Not included in this infographic is the wider benefits of trees as well for the farm business. So obviously wider landscape and society, but also air quality, water quality, boosting biodiversity, protecting crops and livestock, nutrient loss, soil erosion, and obviously flooding. So I've put the QR code for this case study on there because it goes into a lot more detail and it's quite interesting. So if you want to have a look at that in a bit more detail, I'll give you just a second to be able to scan that now. But I think we are we sharing the slides, Graham? I remember what we said now.
Yeah, yes, we are. At the end of the webinar, we'll circulate the recording, which will have the slides. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, just click through. Last one, thank you. So this is just to flag what other grants are available for current woodlands. So the management of those woodlands. So first of all, woodland management plan, you get payment to create a 10-year plan for your woodland, and then you can have a think about going into higher tier. So that's actually managing that woodland. There's capital grants available and tree health grants. So if you've got a woodland that's really suffering from ash dieback or other things, oak processionary moth, for example, then there's grants available that might help you with those issues. Just to go into a bit more detail about the woodland management plan, next please. Just because it's a prerequisite for you to do this to be able to enter countryside stewardship. So it funds the 10-year plan. There's a minimum payment of £1,500. You can apply all year round. And over the last few years, the minimum woodland size has reduced to 0.5 hectares. So hopefully we'll get a few more of our smaller woodlands into management. And included in that is a 10-year felling licence. So like it says there, you need to do a management plan first before you then move into countryside stewardship. And next step, so consider woodland creation opportunities on your land, what's possible, what you want from your woodland, and also we're always happy to come out and have a chat with you. Make sure you've got those clear objectives in your head so you can plan in advance. And yeah, contact us, which is on the next page. So that first one is for woodland creation. So that will take you through to a contact form, which will go through to your area team, and it will go to the right person, and they'll get back to you, and hopefully you'll get a one-to-one visit through that. And then woodland management, that page takes you through to which area team is best to contact regarding woodland management and grants available there. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. That was quite a challenge running through all those grants in 10 minutes. So, but that was a useful just rundown of what's available. So the last speaker is Louise Speak, our Chief Taxation Advisor at the CLA. Tax is one of those things that is always kind of lurking in the background, whatever you do in life, but forestry is no different, and there's some specific tax issues surrounding forestry. So Louise is now going to take us through those. Louise.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. And I'm really just going to give you headlines about the tax considerations. Hopefully, if you've already got commercial woodland, you'll be familiar with some of this, so apologies if you are. But all of this information is available in our guidance note on woodlands, and we are just in the process of updating it to reflect the recent changes to inheritance tax. So bear with us while we do that. Anyway, I'm going to start by just reminding everybody what the definition of commercial woodland is, because that's something that's quite relevant depending on what you're doing. And then just giving you an overview of both the income tax, capital gains tax, inheritance tax, and also VAT. People can overlook VAT, and I think it's worth just keeping it all in mind. So next slide, please, Graham. So we often get questions about whether somebody's got a commercial woodland, and for a tax perspective, we're looking at something that's managed on a commercial basis with a view to the realisation of profits. Now, that is a definition that isn't just unique to woodland, it's really can be applied to other business activities in different contexts in the tax system. But I think it's really important to have that in mind when you're establishing a new woodland. And I think particularly as we're looking at some of the inheritance tax reliefs, you know, if you're not here to say and to explain to HMRC what's happening with your land, your documents need to do it for you. And so having the documents that prove that you've got a commercial woodland is going to be absolutely key. So that would be, you know, having a woodland management plan, having a long-term business plan, particularly for productive timber woodland, and having your separate woodland accounts. So all of that will help demonstrate that you are operating a commercial woodland for tax purposes. So let's turn to income tax and obviously corporation tax. So all of your income is going to be outside the scope of tax, whether you're operating this as a sole trader or through a partnership, or if you're operating it through a company, it's going to be outside scope for corporation tax. And now, plus is that you're not going to be taxed on any profits. And of course, I'm not clear about how great the profits are and the margins are for woodland, but you know, but the difficulty then is you haven't got the ability to set off any expenditure, and then you also can't claim capital allowances. And I think some people then look very carefully at you know, which businesses is paying for their plant and machinery. If you've got a farm and you know you need your tractor for that farm business, then it might be that you're putting it through that. It might be you have to do some sort of apportionment depending on the time being spent that within the different businesses that you operate. So it's always worth keeping that in mind. One of the things you can't do if you do have any profit on timber sales is that you can't set off those profits or those losses against other income streams. So you can't use sideways loss relief. So these are all things to be borne in mind if you're diversifying into a new woodland. Now, there is a limitation to this. You know, you have to have timber that's not been processed or transformed prior to sale. So I think that's taken it beyond perhaps doing just doing a few planks. But, you know, so I think, you know, doing logs and selling those is fine. But, you know, doing too much, I think you're going to lose that exemption. So I think, you know, take advice from people who are very specialists about what that actually means in practice and understanding all the different processes timber may be going through. So next slide, please, Graham. Okay, so capital gains tax. It's not as straightforward when you're selling a woodland. So if you're selling it en bloc and you've still got trees standing, you're going to have to ask your agents to give you a valuation of the standing timber and the underlying land, so that because the trees themselves are exempt, but not the land. It probably means that the actual land is quite low in value when you do it, but I'm not a valuer. So you do need somebody who's expert and used to doing this to be able to apportion those values for you. The good thing is that you can then use reliefs, because although commercial woodland is not a trade for tax purposes, it specifically says in the legislation, in the income tax legislation, it's not a trade. There are specific provisions that allow you to claim capital gains tax reliefs on the land. So, you know, you could use rollover relief to roll over any gain on the land into another trading business. It has to be trading. It can't be into land that you then let out, because that's investment. And so that's very helpful. And actually, you know, if you've had storm damage, or you've had trees that you've planted destroyed by deer or whatever, you know, any insurance payment that you have is also within the exemption. But it all comes back to the fact that you've got to be able to show that you have that commercial woodland. So that is helpful to know that insurance payment isn't taxed. In other contexts, it would be. So again, a benefit for commercial woodland. So on to inheritance tax, please, Graham. So the starting point when we're looking at inheritance tax is business property relief. Commercial woodland will qualify for business property relief. We've still got the minimum ownership requirement that we have for all businesses, but it has to be one that you operate, and I make that clear here. So if you own the woodland and somebody else is running the business because you've let the land to them, that doesn't qualify. And that's a point we have to explain sometimes. You know, some people think that because there's a business operating on that land, that means it qualifies. It has to be you and your business, whether that's you individually as a partnership or it is your company. Next slide, please. So one thing that has been clarified, we've been doing a lot of work with HMRC and Treasury about some of the environmental land management, and they have now updated the inheritance tax manual, and I've given you the page reference on the slide there to say that if you have your land registered and validated to the Woodland Carbon Code, that will qualify in principle for business property relief. So even if you're not managing your woodland for timber generation and you're keeping a section of it purely to sequester in the longer term, those carbon codes, that's really quite helpful. What was not helpful was the reduction in the amount of assets that qualify for 100% relief. So the new term is the 100% relief allowance, and it was £1 million per person. That has gone up. We do recognise that isn't sufficient for a lot of businesses with qualifying assets, and those businesses will still then have to look at 50% relief, and which will result in a tax charge. If you are worried about that, then you probably do need to start thinking about your succession planning, and do take a look at our website. We've got a lot of information to help with that. So next slide, please, Graham. One positive from the budget that wasn't in the original announcement in 2024 is that this allowance is now going to be transferable. So where there is a couple, so whether you're married or several partners, that allowance is transferable. And we were very concerned in it originally where people were widowed, they were only going to get one allowance because, and they held all the assets after the first death. But you don't have to prove that the original, that a deceased spouse had owned the assets. So again, that takes some administrative complexity out of using the double allowance on the second death of a couple. So that's quite helpful, particularly where there's existing woodland. They didn't have to be partners or even joint owners, so that's good news. So next slide, please, Graham. If any woodland is in trust, it's really important to really recognise the difference between trusts that were in existence before the original budget announcement in 2024 and any trust created after that date. Every single trust that was in existence before 2024 has its own relief allowance, and that can be quite important going forward. So before you do anything with those trusts, whether you're taking assets out or closing them down, do take advice from trust experts on that. That's really important, because any trust created by the same settlor, the same individual, is going to have one allowance applied, and it's going to be chronologically across all the different trusts. So if you create 3 trusts a year apart, and one's got £2 million of qualifying assets, the next has £500,000, the first trust gets fully relievable assets, the second trust gets only £500,000 of relievable assets, and the third trust might have £2 million of assets, qualifying assets, that gets nothing. So that's how the relief allowance will apply going forward to trusts created by the same settlor. So next slide, please. So this has been on the statute books already, and it hasn't really been used because with commercial woodland, you had 100% relief for commercial woodlands. And actually, this has come back into the spotlight again. I don't think it's that effective as a relief. It is only a deferral on the value of timber. So again, you're having to look at the differentials and splitting out the value of a woodland between the timber that's growing and the timber on land. And you've got a longer period of ownership. And I talk about beneficial ownership here because you know, it's that there can be a difference between legal ownership and who has the beneficial ownership, so the right to any proceeds from that woodland. The relief isn't automatic, it has to be claimed. But the trouble is any disposal can trigger that tax, so that's not helpful. And one of the things we're doing is we're talking to MPs about tabling amendments to the finance bill, is to improve how this relief operates. The Treasury wouldn't discuss specific changes to APR and BPR for woodlands, but but we can go and ask for changes on this because it's a different relief altogether. So we are trying to get that extended so it's the value of the woodland that's protected, not just the timber, and to simplify things and make it a more worthwhile relief. We may not get it through because of the majority in this government, but it's one of those things that we can keep asking for until we get somewhere. We will keep working on that. So let's turn to VAT now, Graham. Thank you. So sales of timber are going to be standard rated, and I've got the list there. I'm not going to run through them all because you'll be getting the slides after this. So all those supplies are standard rated. Next slide, please, Graham. So the only time that any supply of timber related products is reduced rated is if it's linked to really fuel, and it's got to be provided for domestic or charity use. So it's usually because it's sold in packs and it's described as, you know, wood burner fuel or whatever. And then it is going to be 5%. If you're supplying wood chips to a business, that's going to be standard rated. And apportionment if it's going to be for mixed use. Next slide, please, Graham. So there were a lot of questions, and there's still a lot of questions about things like carbon credits and the tax treatment of them. And there's an ongoing group looking at how payments are to be treated. But we did eventually get some clarity out of HMRC about the VAT treatment of carbon credits. You may have already seen the revenue brief, and it's also been updated in their manual. And so I've given you the page reference there too. I think the key thing to notice with those is it's only transactions since 2024, but it has to be in a proper Woodland Carbon Coast scheme. You cannot just do a voluntary agreement to sell credits. So it's about the making sure they're verifiable and genuine credits, and to be able to charge the VAT. Next slide, please, Graham. Just finally, just really with VAT, as always, you should make sure any agreement that is going to be subject to VAT specifies that the payments you're going to receive are going to be subject to that. And there's cases on this where the agreements weren't clear, not necessarily in this context, but generally. And if it's not clear, the default is that the payments are going to be inclusive. So please do make sure your agreements are well drawn up to be absolutely clear, because otherwise it could be uneconomic if you've got to account for 20% of any payments for the units. So please make sure you get proper advice on how the agreements are drawn up to deal with VAT. So that's it for me, Graham. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Louise. We're now into our sort of question time, or time for questions. We've got, how long we got? 10 minutes or so before the end. So any questions that you have now would be the time to think about. There's a few that have come through, which I'm just going to look through just now. But I had one of my own, just a fairly sort of straightforward one, just to kick us off, which was, do you need to be? It's probably one more for Chris, but do you need to be doing a large woodland if you're going to be doing woodland creation for production in mind? Does it need to be large, or can you do sort of smaller ones too?
It doesn't have to be large. It depends a little bit on your objectives, in so much as if you want to make significant income from it and you want it to be generating income fairly quickly, then larger woodlands it's easier to do that with. Larger woodlands tend to be more economically manageable because just you get the economies of scale. However, if I give you a couple of examples, you know, a small corner woodland that's producing firewood every 10 years can be a really productive resource. And certainly, you know, when I think about the resource that we've got at home on the farm, you know, the areas that I would plant up when I get my chance to do what I want, the areas that I will plant up will be areas that I will be planting up with older coppice and things like that, where I'll be cropping them every 10, 15 years to generate firewood income, well, firewood for myself and for the family. So that's a productive resource in what would probably be less than, well, it'd be about an acre, probably something like that. Do you know what I mean? So it just depends on what you're trying to achieve. And some of the broadleaf trees, things like cherry and things like that, you don't need many of them grown well to produce quite a significant return in 30 years time if you can keep them squirrel free. So it just depends a little bit on what your objectives are, Graham.
Yeah. Okay. Well, just moving on from that, there was a question from Felicity Winters, I think was the name. How do you decide what trees to remove when you're thinning?
It depends a little bit on, again, comes back to your objectives, what you're trying to achieve. The way I would split it out is there's two main ways to go with it. One is if you're moving towards clear felling standard trees at the end, so you're gonna realise your return in sort of 40, 50, 60 years time. What you're trying to do really is focus the volume and the growth of timber on the best trees in that stand. So what you're trying to do is remove competing trees and the poorer quality trees, so that the trees that come out at the end are as good as they can be, and you maximise that value. Okay, that's what we're after. And one of the things these days, which is a little bit different to what was perhaps the past before biomass and wood fuel took off, is that, you know, there's an income to be generated from thinnings now. So the small diameter material that you're coming out, there is actually a market for it, as well as maybe 20, 30 years ago. Once we got rid of the pit prop market and we hadn't started biomass, there was a bit of a lull there where it was hard to sell that stuff. There's a good market for thinnings now. So remove the poorer stuff, encourage the better trees. If you're going down the CCF route, where you want to maintain some of those trees for a long, long time and start to regenerate another stands underneath, what you're really trying to do is promote trees which are going to be stable in the long term and that are going to produce good seed and a good secondary crop. You know, in genetics, it's just like livestock breeding. You want the better trees to reproduce. In that case, you might remove some of the bigger trees which are competing with those trees and suppressing the crowns. So your thinning will be a little bit more patchy. You might leave some of the poorer trees until next time you come into the woodland, because what you're really trying to do is develop trees that have got a good wide rooting system on them and a good wide crown that's going to be able to produce lots of seed and be wind firm in the future. So depending on what you're trying to do, which trees you remove will vary a little bit. And again, I talked about forest development types, and I'll share some links to the stuff I've talked about. You know, there are prescriptions to how you approach this depending on what your objectives are, basically.
Okay. Thanks. I had a question here from Tom Yeomans. How can we access the list of species and their specific environmental requirements? Is there a recommended list provided?
Yeah, so there's two sort of separate things really. One is I mentioned the ecological site classification tool. That's an online tool that basically produces a list of all species that realistically we know something about and that we can quantify their requirements in terms of sites, etc. So you could go in there and you'll see which species are listed in there. The forest development types booklet is also a really good piece of information, because it really talks about how species work together and how you would grow them. So it lets you think about what you might be able to achieve. There are some very good books out there. I'll maybe send around a link to a couple of books off the back of this. But the Forest Research also has a really good website where they've got a list of I'm going to be brutally honest, the Forest Research website's a little bit difficult to navigate, but they do have a species list on there where there's species profiles available for you to go and look at, and that's got a lot of information about the individual species and what they're required to grow, what they can be used for, what the properties are, etc. So that's where we're at the moment. But again, you know, local woodland officer or an agent will be able to point you in the right direction as well in terms of what your options might be.
Okay. I had a question from Carol Johnson, who was asking, can you plant for timber production through the UCO grant, the English Woodland Creation Offer?
Yes,
So
you
that's
can.
probably to you, Natalie. Sorry.
Yeah, you can. You just need to have a chat with the Forestry Commission, make sure that you're going to be planting in the right places, that they deem acceptable, that we deem acceptable, but you may need to forego some of those additional contributions that I mentioned, because they require certain spacing and a certain amount of trees in, etc. So you can do it, but it just depends what species you're wanting to plant. So yeah, you just might need to have further conversations with the Forestry Commission about it.
Okay, that's good. Tom Lester asks, what are the Forestry Commission, CLA and others doing to counter the narrative of the Woodland Trust, who are quite vocal and have the ear of many in government? And last time I looked, seemed to eschew the benefits of conifers, favouring only hardwoods. I mean, from a CLA perspective, I'll just take that one first. We're not taking the view of either or. Hardwoods have their place. Native woodland, amenity woodland with non-commercial objectives is fine if that's what the landowner wishes to do and the site is suitable. Equally, we are completely recognise as an organisation that we need productive woodlands and timber production as well on land that is suited to that, where the landowner would like to pursue that. So from our perspective, we don't take an either or. It's very much driven by the objectives of the landowner and the requirements of the site. So I don't know if either of Natalie or Chris, if you have a view from the Forestry Commission on hardwoods versus conifers.
I mean, I think for what it's worth, I spent a lot of my time having this exact discussion. I think you're exactly right in what you said, Graham, in terms of it's not either or, it's what's suitable for your objectives and the site that you've got. So we you know, broadleaves can equally be productive and are productive. It's just a different kind of management and a different kind of silviculture. I think the big thing for us is that we've worked really hard to get policy documents which actually reflect that value of timber and gain government commitment to it, because until fairly recently the challenge we've had is that whilst there's been a unrecognised ambition to plant more timber and to have more timber, and we know we need it, having a document which you could refer back to as evidence that that is what we need and we'll work towards creating it has been quite challenging. So the environmental improvement plan, the actions we managed to secure in there, as well as the timber and construction roadmap, really give us that that foundation for then taking that message out. And you know, the fact that we sat here talking this morning is an example of what we now that we've got that sort of backing and we've got that underpinning. This is an example of how we're now starting to get that message out there and underline the importance of that more productive resource.
Okay, thanks. We're very short of time now. Maybe one quick answer, because there was a couple on tax and we haven't managed to get to all the questions. I apologise for that, but we'll try to answer at least one, and maybe we'll follow up later. But one to Louise. How long does Olivia McGarvey, I think is the name. How long does a commercial woodland need to be managed for to be able to benefit for tax purposes, BPR? Is there a minimum amount of years? Is there an answer to that?
Well, you've got to have 2 years for business property for everything. So, for example, if you set up a new company to own and manage that woodland, you have to own the shares in that company for 2 years. And it has to be doing the qualifying activities for that full period. So I would say that's your starting point.
Okay.
But have the documentation to demonstrate the commerciality.
Yeah, documentation is key, I think, isn't it?
I'm just going to answer very quickly another one, Graham, while I've got the floor. Daniel has asked a question about the transferability of the allowance, and the spouse does not have to have owned any relevant property when they die, and that's still going to be the case after 2026 because of the way they've worded the legislation. But I highlighted the fact that people who died before the change was announced, because that was where the concern was. But it'll be all couples If the assets transfer on death 1 to a spouse on death 2, you don't have to prove that they'd owned the qualifying assets.
Okay. Thanks, Louise. I'm afraid we're out of time. There was a couple more questions, but we'll maybe try to answer those in writing afterwards. But thank you very much for everyone for tuning in. Thank you to our speakers, Chris and Natalie from Forestry Commission, and to Louise from CLA covering tax. Hopefully you found it a useful hour and a quarter or so, and thank you for attending. Look out for the post-event email, and we'll bid you good day. Thank you. Bye.